So I'd like you to imagine someone of the opposite sex walking up to you on the street and say, "Hi, I've been noticing you around lately. I find you very attractive." And they ask you one of three questions. Would you go out on a date with me? Would you come back to my apartment with me? Would you have sex with me? So these are actual empirical studies. The first one was done in the state of Florida, and these are the results of that study. Of the women approached by the male confederate, that's what we call the people who are members of the experimental team, confederates. It doesn't mean someone from the South of the United States. Of the women approached, 56% agreed to go out on the date with the guy. 6% agreed to go back to his apartment. 0% agreed to have sex with him. Women in this sex condition, in fact, thought it was a rather peculiar question. Most women need a little bit more information before they agree to the sex. Of the men approached by the female of the experimenter team, about 50% agreed to go out on a date with her. 69% agreed to go back to her apartment, and 75% agreed to have sex with her. Of the 25% of the men who declined, several were apologetic about it, citing a girlfriend, a fiancé, asking for a phone number and a rain check. Very different responses. Now, this talk is about conflict between the sexes, and I'm going to talk about 6 regions in which men and women get into conflict. And the first one is desire for sexual variety. Now, let's imagine that I am king of the universe, and I will give you your magic wish. How many sex partners would you like to have over the next month, over the next 10 years, or in your lifetime? Just get a number in mind. How many would you like to have in your lifetime? Okay, do you have the numbers in mind? Okay, well, here's what we found. Ideal number of sex partners, women said on average they would like to have 7/10 of a sex partner over the next month, gradually escalating to a full sex partner at 6 months and leveling off at about 4 to 5 in the lifespan. Men thought 2 in the next month would be about right, 8 in the next couple years, and 18 in the lifespan. This was after eliminating 3 men in our sample who said they would like 1,000. As we'll see, this desire for sexual variety on men's part is one of the key sources of conflict between the sexes. A second is what we call the sexual overperception bias. And the classic example, and this is highly replicated in my lab and other labs, is you show a videotape or photographs or just have people observe a man and a woman interacting. And after a few minutes, the woman smiles at the man. Stop the videotape and ask, why did the woman smile? What was her intention? What was she trying to signal? Men are more likely than women to say, oh, she was sending sexual signals. She wants his body. It's obvious. Women seeing exactly the same film say, no, she was just being friendly. She was being polite. So men have this sexual overperception bias, and it's interesting that in our laboratory studies where we had, it's basically a speed dating paradigm where men and women interact with each other briefly and then evaluate how interested the other person is in them and how interested they are in the other person, that the sexual overperception bias is most likely to occur with women who are physically attractive. And what's interesting about that is because attractive women are hit on more often, they are least likely to reciprocate that sexual attraction. It's also the case we found that men who are high on narcissism are especially prone to the sexual overperception bias. They think they're hot, but they're not. Moving to sexual conflict number 3, deception. I hate to break it to you, but men sometimes lie. But they lie in very specific ways. And we've done studies of lying on internet dating sites, which are very common nowadays. Something like 38% of all couples have met on an internet dating site. But men lie in very predictable ways. So, for example, they lie about their height. So they tend to, if they're 5'8", they tend to say they're 6 feet tall. They kind of round up by about 2 inches on average. They lie about their income. They lie about their status. Now, women also deceive in internet dating. They tend to shave about 15 pounds off of their weight. And both sexes post photographs that are not truly representative of what they actually look like. That's why you have to meet someone in person to see whether there is actually true sexual chemistry. But when you do, men continue to lie. And one of the things they lie about is the depths of their feelings, the depths of their emotions in order to have sex. So this is bad, but it's especially upsetting to a woman. So if you want to upset a woman, declare that you love her. I really love you. I have deep feelings for you. Now let's have sex. And you have sex, and then after the sex, after he has an orgasm, he says, actually, I was just kidding. I don't love you at all. Goodbye. Well, women in our studies extremely upset by that. On a 7-point scale, they max out. Men who are deceived in that by a woman, not too bothered. So, she doesn't love me, I can live with that. Now, some people interpret these findings to mean that, well, women are just more emotional than men, so of course they're going to get upset about everything. But it's not true. That stereotype is inaccurate, because men get upset about other sorts of things. It's domain specific. For example, misled him about her willingness to have sex, or led to believe that sex is forthcoming and said no at the last minute. Men more upset about that than women. Sexual conflict number 4, mate value discrepancies. Mate value, you have to distinguish between short-term mate value and long-term mate value. Long-term mate value, it consists of a large number of qualities. So it's not just physical attractiveness, it's also the esteem in which other people hold you, your status, your reputation, your personality, your level of intelligence, your health, and even your sense of humor. Humor turns out to be a very important quality, although not everybody believes it. The comedian Jim McFarland said, one of the things women claim is important in a man is a sense of humor. In my years as a comedian, I've learned that they're usually referring to the humor of guys like Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and Russell Crowe. Apparently, those guys are hilarious. But humor is important. Humor actually does convey a wealth of information about someone's verbal skills, their level of intelligence, their social skills, and even perspective taking. It requires a certain level of mind reading to get people to laugh. Now, back to the mate value discrepancies. How do mate value discrepancies cause conflict? Well, it's illustrated by a female colleague of mine who was complaining to me one day. She said, David, why is it that all the guys that I'm interested in don't seem to show any interest in me, yet I'm pursued by all these guys who are trying to chat me up, and I have no interest in them? And what I told her is, I said, I was brutally honest, I said, on the mating market, you are an 8 seeking 10s and being lusted after by 6s. And she said that this single piece of information, when she thought about it, was more important to her, was more helpful to her than 3 years of psychotherapy to figure out what the problem was. She was going for guys who were too high in mate value. Now, the problem with going for people who are too high in mate value, and this applies to both men and women, is even if you succeed, if you're an 8, you succeed in attracting a 9 or a 10 into a long-term relationship, they are more likely to leave you when someone better comes along, statistically, and also they're more likely to be sexually unfaithful to you, okay, statistically speaking. Which brings us to sexual conflict number 5, infidelity. Now, from a male's perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, it's fairly straightforward why men would be tempted to have affairs. How many people have affairs? I won't ask you to raise your hands on this one. But studies point to about 40 to 50% of married men have an affair at some point during the course of their marriage, and it's about 20 to 30% of women. Women are actually catching up with men. So not everybody has affairs, but a substantial number of people, substantial minority do. And it's fairly clear why men do. Studies of motivations for infidelity for men involve, they say, sexual variety. The woman was there. The opportunity presented itself. I wanted to have sex. Women, it's more complicated. Now, for women, my evolutionary colleagues, other scientists who study this, have advanced what's called the dual mating strategy hypothesis, or the good genes hypothesis, where they basically propose that women can get the best of both worlds by getting investment and resources from one man and good genes, like genes for good health, from another man. But I think there's reason to be skeptical about this. One of the reasons is that we know from DNA fingerprinting technology that only 2 to 3% of offspring are actually fathered by men who are other than the person believed to be the father, the husband, or the regular mate. So what that means is that most women are getting genes and investment from the same guy. So that raises the puzzle, why do women have affairs? And this is something that my lab has studied, and I think there are some important clues. Okay, one is that women who have affairs tend to be sexually and emotionally unhappy with their regular relationship. And you may be thinking, as I would be, well, that's totally obvious. Okay, women who are unhappy with their relationship are going to be more likely to have affairs. But it turns out it's not true for men. If you compare men who have affairs with men who don't have affairs, there is no difference in their marital happiness. But there is a huge difference for women. Clue number 2, 70% of women who become emotionally involved with their affair partners or fall in love with their affair partners. Now, if you're just trying to get good genes, this seems like a very bad strategy. Why get emotionally involved or fall in love? And the third clue is that the qualities desired in an affair partner turn out to be more or less identical to the qualities desired in a long-term mate. And so what I think this does, this set of clues combined with other evidence, points to the mate switching hypothesis, which I think is a more compelling hypothesis about why women have affairs. So in our lab, we've also documented that women tend to cultivate what we call backup mates. One woman told me, she said, men are like soup. You always want to have some on the back burner, okay? In case something goes wrong with your relationship. Of course, some of this information might be disturbing to the males in the audience. It might be disturbing to realize that your partner is cultivating surreptitiously backup mates, that they have fantasies, sexual fantasies about people other than you, and that maybe perhaps someone who's just a friend, oh, he's just a friend. Or that maybe you're more replaceable than you realize. Which brings us to the last sexual conflict, breaking up. Now, Reka asked you if you've ever experienced a romantic breakup. Studies show that about 85% of all people have experienced at least one romantic breakup. It's a very, very common thing. It is rare to meet the one and only when you're 18 years old and then live in happily ever after monogamous bliss for the next 50 years. It happens sometimes, but it's rare. People engage in what I call serial mating with one person for, I don't mean Cheerios or Wheaties or anything, meeting with one person, breaking up, mating with another person for a while, and some people get better at it with time. Now, breaking up involves a lot of conflict, and it's one of the most heart-wrenching phenomena that people go through. I mean, people get depressed, they start drinking, they start abusing drugs, they go into depressions, etc. It's a very intense, emotionally laden thing, even if you're doing the dumping. Okay, it's worse if you get dumped, but it's even bad for the person doing the dumping. And it results in conflicts over sexual access. Does sex continue after the breakup? And sometimes it does for a period. There's some oscillation. Conflict over division of pooled resources. So couples often pool their resources. I know one couple that got into a bitter divorce over who would get the dog. And of course, there are financial resources, and there's sometimes conflict over remating. And this is one of the darker aspects of work from my lab. I've studied victims of stalking. But we've looked at about 2,500 victims of stalking, and it turns out it's a fairly common strategy post-breakup. Often starts as the relationship is starting to fall apart. People cyber stalk their partners, they hack into their cell phones, they trace them on Facebook, etc., and sometimes physically follow them. And men, of course, are more likely to stalk. So about 80% of the stalkers are men. Men who are high on what we call the dark triad are especially prone to stalking. That is, men who are highly narcissistic, they feel a sense of entitlement. Men who are Machiavellian, that is, use an interpersonally exploitative, manipulative strategy in their social interactions. And men who are high on what's called psychopathy, which basically involves, one of the hallmarks is a lack of empathy. So you basically get a cold, calculating, narcissistic, self-entitled guy, statistically more likely to stalk. Disturbingly, stalking sometimes works. In our study, 15% of the victims of stalking ended up getting back together with their ex, either temporarily for sexual interactions or more permanently. One woman told us that her ex-boyfriend would threaten any guy who came around, and after 6 months, she said she went back to her ex-boyfriend because there were no other guys around. So I think that there are three pieces of information that I hope might be useful for you in your own mating lives. One has to do with if you're ever a victim of stalking. If you're ever a victim of stalking, do not be friendly to your stalker, and especially don't smile at your stalker, because that triggers the sexual overperception bias and reinforces the stalking behavior. Okay, number two is that sexual overperception bias. Men need to realize that the inferences that they make about the intentions of women when they smile or even when they give an incidental touch on the arm, that's another one. Incidental touch on the arm, a man thinks, oh boy, that's a signal. Men need to realize that sometimes they are over-inferring sexual interest when it's not there. It could be politeness, friendliness, or it could even be anxiety because the guy's a creep. And the third thing is to realize that we have a very complex mating psychology, a complex sexual psychology that involves, at a minimum, a system designed for sexual attraction and a system designed for long-term pair bonding, involving attachment and the emotion of love, which turns out to be universal. And I know one man told me that when he understood the logic of this, that there are these two evolved systems, it helped him to stay more faithful to his wife, because he realized that when he was attracted to women who were other than his wife, he realized, oh, that's just my evolved desire for sexual variety. It doesn't mean I don't love my wife. So that enabled him to remain more faithful to her and, I think, lived happily ever after. So, in conclusion, I would just like to wish all of you the best of success in your own mating lives, and I hope some of this information helps you to reduce conflict between the sexes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.